Well, this week we are actually going. I'm going to start you a little earlier than where we're supposed to be at. So we're supposed to be in 22. However, that parable is actually linked to two other parables. So a lot of times in the Bible, what will happen is Jesus doesn't tell you one parable, but he tells you three of them because he knows we're not going to get it. So I'm just going to read this part here. So this is out of chapter 21, and I'm going to be in verse 23 here. So this is what prompted the parables. And when Jesus entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" And Jesus said to them, I will also ask you one question. If you tell me the answer, then I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? And then they argued with one another. If we say from heaven, he will say, why then do you not believe him? But if we say of human origins, we are afraid of the crowd, for all regard John as a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we do not know. And he said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. And so then after that, Jesus talks to them about these three separate parables. And he talks about this first parable of the two sons, which is a man asks his two sons to go work in the vineyard. Again, the vineyard, what symbolizes what? Israel. And generally the landowner and the guy who does this is God. So the father, so one of them says, he says, sons, go out and work in the vineyard. One goes, nope, I'm not going to do it. But he feels guilty afterwards and says, okay, I'll go out and do it. The other son says, yep, I'll go right away and do it. Never does it. And which of the two did the will of the Father is the question that Jesus asks. And they say the first. And truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. And so Jesus is, yeah, he's making a lot of friends. So he's talking about, he's trying to get the leaders to understand, are you actually following what God wants you to do? And so this is all these parables are in response to the authorities saying, well, by what authority are you doing this? And Jesus is saying, are you guys really the authority? Do you really understand, what God is requiring of you as leaders in the church to do? And then we get this next parable, the parable of the wicked tenants. Again, there was a landowner who planted a vineyard, God, Israel, put a fence around it, dug a wine press, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the harvest time is due, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce, but the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other slaves, more than the first, so they treated them in the same way. And finally he sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance. So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will you do with the tenants? And so the people, again, are the high priest and stuff like, oh yeah, he's going to come and just get rid of them, kill them, and stuff like that. And Jesus is like, do you know who you are in this story? Do you realize you are the people that are working in the vineyard, that have not done what God's asked, But it sort of seems like the leaders are sort of clueless at this point. They're just like, they're not able to put two and two together. They're not able to see that what Jesus is reminding them, and this is something that's happened earlier too. I think we read about it this last year with King David, where one of the prophets, I think it was it Nathaniel, was talking to King David about a sheep, and tells him the story about how this poor man sheep gets taken away by the rich man, and David gets so mad. He says, I will find this man, and I will, he will have to answer for what he's done. And then the prophet goes, well, I'm really talking about you. And David's like, oh, that's not good. And in some sense, we see these type of stories time and again where people are told sort of what is happening, but they don't realize that they are the ones doing it. And so again, this is it's something that replays time and time again in the Bible, and for us in our lives too. How many times have we done stuff and then all of a sudden we feel like we're the righteous ones, and we look back and go, oh yeah, we shouldn't probably have done it that way, or this isn't how that situation I thought it was going to go this way, but it really did this something different. So,
And they finally did get it in verse 45. The reaction was to try to arrest him and kill him.
yeah, you don't like it when people don't like it when you show them up. People get really mad when you show them up and you say, this is what you've done wrong. People get really defensive. People get really mad. And then, and Jesus is sort of pressing his luck here. So he's going to the third parable right now. So that's the one we're going to be in. So why don't someone read 1 through 5, and then we'll take it from there.
Jesus also told them other parables. He said, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a king who prepared a great wedding feast for his son. When the banquet was ready, he sent his servants to notify those who were invited, but they all refused to come. So he sent other servants to tell them, the feast has been prepared. The bulls and the fattened calf have been killed, and everything is ready. Come to the banquet. But the guests he had invited ignored them and went their own way, one to his farm, another to his business.
6 through 10.
Well, the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet. Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so the wedding hall was filled with guests.
And finish this out, 11 to 14.
But when the king came in to look over the dinner guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes, and he said to him, friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes? And the man was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.
So, a nice cheery parable to have on a Sunday morning.
Were you in here when Loretta said never let a man plan a wedding? That's what she got out of it.
Yeah, it's a tough parable. It's not a very meek and mild parable that we expect out of
No.
Jesus. So what do you think is going on in this? Given that context that we just had not that long ago.
What surprised me about this one is that the king got angry.
He got angry, yeah.
On the other one, some of the other parables, he's real gracious and generous.
Yeah.
Paying, the laborers the same amount.
Yep.
In this one, the king gets angry.
Yeah, exactly. So that's interesting too. We normally don't see, from time to time we do hear about a guy getting mad and stuff like that, but not a lot of times when Jesus was around though. And how many times did Jesus get mad? A couple times. Yeah. There wasn't a lot. You didn't hear a lot of
Money.
Yeah.
All
yeah.
the money.
Yeah, he didn't get really mad very often. So like I said, that makes us take notice in this. Okay, we're like, well, what's going on? So if we think back to the people that were reading this text originally, what do you think was going on in their lives at that point in time when it comes to how they were being treated where they were going to church or to the synagogue? How were they being treated? Do you guys remember?
Well, did they have to, offer a lot of things? If they did this wrong, they had to offer this up. If they, that kind of thing, they had to pay.
Well,
pay
so the one thing with, so this is a time when Matthew's community, so Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism are sort of going at it right now because the temple has been destroyed. So the temple where people would find God was destroyed. Now here's the interesting thing about that. Who destroyed the temple?
Romans.
Jews. Romans sacked the city. The Jews did not want them to get the temple. So there's been some talk that the Jews actually destroyed the temple so that the Romans couldn't desecrate it. At least that was one of the theories in my commentary. So take that for what it will. So in some sense, yes, the Romans did destroy it because they were sacking the city. The Jews didn't want them to desecrate their temple, and so they tore it down or took care of it. So you have the temple system, the system that when Jesus was around, this was going on. They've been having the system for a long, long time. And now you have two different viewpoints going at it right now. You have Christians who believe in Jesus, and you have the rabbinic Judaism that believes that the Messiah has not come yet, that it's just about God, and that how do we have teachers that teach us how to do stuff, but what do we do now that God is gone? While Christians, on the other hand, are like, God is no longer confined to the temple. God is everywhere. And so you have two different viewpoints. The hard part about that is who won that argument? The rabbinic Judaism won that argument. So the synagogues were full of the teachers of rabbinic Judaism. So now you have these Christians coming in there saying we want to worship and stuff like that, and they're like, you get out. You can't stay around here. You don't believe the same thing we believe. You don't belong with us. So now the synagogues, much like the 1950s church, was the hub of all of their life. And now they're being sent out. They're not allowed to be with the people that need to be. They don't have the social stuff like they had before. They don't have the economic stuff they had before, all because they're Christian. And they're trying to deal with that. And so it's interesting that when Matthew writes this, Matthew's writing that is in some sense is trying to calm them down and say, don't worry, God is with you. God is walking with you through this. You can see how God is treating the people that have treated you. So God is angry. God is saying it's not just because you were part of the flock before doesn't mean you're part of the flock now. It's sort of what Matthew is getting at with that you have to live your life accordingly, or it doesn't really count. God doesn't want only people who think about faith, not people who don't live their faith. So that's sort of what this parable is getting at. And you can see that because there's that one piece at the end. There's a couple interesting pieces. So the first piece is that there's this guy who shows up at the end. And in a lot of commentaries, they'll say, well, the guest is supposed to get some robes as he comes into the party. Well, that's one commentary. The commentary I was reading today says no. They just need to wear white when they come in. So they should have just come in. The guy comes. This particular person just walks in with his dirty clothes on, and expect everything to be fine. And the host or the king comes up to him and says, "Hey, where's your wedding garb?" And the guy's like, "Isn't this okay?" And that's why he gets thrown out, is because that wedding garb represents living a Christian life. So the guy comes into the church saying, hey, I'm a Christian, and yet doesn't live out that Christian life. And the king or God throws him out saying, no, if you're going to be a Christian, you need to live like a Christian. Christianity isn't all about being up here. It's living your life through that. And so so that's one piece. The other piece, who were the people that came into that party? Who were the last people invited? You can look at the Bible. Okay. Anybody, right?
Good and bad.
Yeah.
Good and bad. Now, haven't we been hearing this a lot through Jesus, too, in the Gospel of Matthew? What's another parable where we hear about good and bad being put together? Got to do with
The wheat?
the wheat, yeah. The weeds and the wheat. We're hearing this a lot, that there's going to be, that the church isn't, just because you're coming to church doesn't mean that, it's not about just showing up at the church. It's not just showing up at the synagogue. What you're seeing time and time again, it's how do you live your faith out? How do you live out what God wants you to do? And it's, if we say we are going to act like this, we need to act like this. And so you're seeing this time and time again coming up, parable after parable. It isn't just like one and done. Oh yeah, by the way, you should probably live it out. And Jesus is even more explicit, because who's he talking to again in this text? The Pharisees, yeah. You guys need to live out, what you're supposed to do. Which is why a lot of people don't like to be pastors, because you're on the hook for what you're doing. God holds, I would say, teachers and preachers more responsible to say, hey, are you living that life you're supposed to be living? So another interesting thing about this particular parable, it shows there's a twin parable of this that shows up in Luke, but it's a little different. It's a little different. You might have heard that story as well too. Let's go
14?
to Luke. Let's take a look at Luke 14, because I think that's an interesting difference, because they're different. They're not the same. Let's see. That is
Page 849.
perfect. Go.
2023.
Let's see, 15 to 24. Okay. So let me read this one. So one of the dinner guests, on hearing this, said to him, "Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of heaven." Then Jesus said to him, "Someone gave a great dinner and invited many. At the time for the dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is ready now.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, 'I have bought a piece of land, and I must go and see it. Please accept my regrets.' Another said, 'I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm going to try them out. Please accept my regrets.' Another said, 'I have just been married, and therefore I cannot come.' So the slave returned and reported to this master. Then the owner of the house became angry and said to the slave, 'Go out at once into the streets and lanes of the town, and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' And the slave said, 'Sir, what you have ordered has been done, and there is still room.' Then the master said to the slave, 'Go to the roads and the lanes and compel people to come in, so that my house may be filled, for I tell you, none of those who are invited will taste my dinner.'" So, they're similar, but yet, in some sense, very different. You don't have a town completely destroyed in Matthew. So, and also, as you remember, Luke is written for a different audience. And where it's placed in the text is also different as well, too. So, because the next parable is the cost of discipleship. So, for Luke, Luke's going to talk about how following God, how costly that is. While in the Matthew text, Jesus is talking to them about authority, who's got authority, why I have authority, and why you need to live a Christian life. So it's a little different. So, what other questions do you have about the text? Besides making sure that the guy doesn't plan the wedding.
I guess what I don't like
Mhm.
is the very last sentence, "For many are called, but few are chosen."
Yeah.
I thought that he would be a little bit more inclusive.
Okay. So again, who's his audience that he's speaking to?
Of the Pharisees.
Yeah. So we always have to think of the context of who the audience is, who Jesus is talking to. Because as we read through the text as well too, we see that everybody they gathered everybody good and bad into the wedding feast. And so, in some sense, it also many are called, few are chosen. It also just sort of talks about how do we interact with our faith. Are we somebody who just comes on a Sunday morning and hope to sing a couple good hymns and not fall asleep during the message and then go back home, or what does our faith really look like? It really asks us that hard question that Matthew asks us many times in this text. As we've been walking through Matthew, you're seeing a lot of times that Matthew is asking us to have a new perspective on things. And so this part of the text is asking us, especially for leaders, what is your perspective on faith? Do you live your faith out? Do you listen when God calls to you? That type of stuff. What else is hard about this text, or parts that make you go, I don't like this parable?
The excuses were, are just like ours, I guess, now. Excuses not to go to church.
Yeah. Or have faith, or to, I don't have time. I don't have the resources. I don't think it's worthwhile.
Don't have the clothes.
Don't have the clothes.
Verse 6 is kind of disturbing because it's the people that are going out with the message that are abused and killed, mistreated. We see prosecution of Christians still today in countries where they don't want to hear the Christian message.
Correct. Yeah, you have people die. You have thrown in prison. Yeah, it's,
Hard to be that messenger and keep up the fight.
Or even here in the States as well, too, from the perspective that, people don't, at one point in time, Christianity was a lot more accepted, but nowadays we're going into a period of time where it's not, you are a bigot for preaching the gospel. You don't understand, you don't understand other people. You don't allow them to have, their opinions. I'm like, well, they can have their opinions, but I don't have to agree with their opinions. So.
There's more mission churches in the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's more mission churches.
We have people from Africa coming over here
Yeah.
to do missionary work
Yeah.
because there's a lot more. Yeah, like I said, if we just even look at the city of Baldwin, so if we look at the stats from, I think it was like 2016, that half the people in Baldwin do not, that was back in 2016, half the people in Baldwin do not have a church home. At least half. It's probably more than that today. It's probably 60 to 70% probably don't have a church home right now.
From what I remember as a kid going here, church was always filled, wasn't it? Every Sunday, Louise, wasn't it?
Every church was
Yeah, it was
filled.
filled.
And
But
Sunday
not
school.
anymore.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Sad.
yeah.
All the rooms were
We
full
didn't
of
have room.
kids
Yeah, you're exactly
at
right.
Sunday school.
Huge confirmation class?
Huge.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but people have different priorities now, and how. So the other thing too is how do you get people interested in coming to church? Because back in the day, we just open our doors and say, "Okay, everybody, come on in," and people are like, "Oh, this is great." And now we're at a point where people are like, I know people who won't come here because it's a church. They won't come to the food shelf because it's a church.
Oh.
Because they expect me to proselytize to them when they show up. And I'm like, no, we're just going to give you food. That's all we're going to do. But people aren't always really appreciative of clergy anymore, which I get too, because clergy haven't done a really good job of being that beacon that we need to be.
Because I know Claire talks to all the people.
Yep, Claire talks to all the people. And I will go pray with people, but that's only at their request. So, But yeah, I mean, it's
Well, it was the stores that opened up their doors to go shopping on Sunday. That's what started the
yeah,
whole.
Yep.
yeah. So that
We
we're
have nothing else to do but go to church. I mean that, really,
Yeah.
or visit.
Vis- so now, like I said, so now we're in an opposite sort of situation where people. So how do we get people to see that faith has value, that church has value, that the community of faith has value? And I think that's because I think there's a lot of people out there who are, well, you hear this all the time. They're spiritual but not religious. Or you have people who say, well, I can be a solo Christian. And I always tell people, good luck with that, because that's not how Christianity works. Christianity is about being in groups. It's about supporting one another, because it's, that's part of the faith journeys that we walk together. So,
To not neglect the coming together.
yeah, you have to come together.
I
so.
said I watched it on YouTube Sunday. Why do people do this every Sunday? I mean, you don't see one person in church.
Except me.
Yeah, except him.
You know what made me feel very sad is I like to check a lot of YouTube videos on
Yeah.
Facebook and
Yeah.
everything about God. It's very sad to see the new generation, the new kids. They don't believe in God.
Mhm.
They argument so much. It's. Do you remember what I told you a couple of times
Yeah.
when I watch a lot of videos? It's so sad to see.
How many
They argument
churches?
so much. They don't believe in God. They got the science
Right.
reasons, Yeah, it is.
Well, yeah.
You went to church down when in Lima.
Mhm.
How was it there? Is there not as many people in church as there was when you were a kid? Is
It's
it the
the,
same
when
there?
I went to church the first Sunday, wow, people was even in the door. There's a lot of people. But I know that something. It's not a young people, maybe in the 30s, in the 20s, pretty much old people.
Right.
Know? You don't see any young people anymore. I don't see any.
Right. It's getting them to see that value, and then they see and the part that I think with this parable and the way that Matthew's been teaching us this time around is people get interested in faith because they see you. They see how you live your life. They see how you act. They see how you communicate with other people. And it's through that they come to Jesus, because they ask the question, well, why did you forgive that person? Or why didn't you just go off on them? Or why didn't you just, they see what happens in everyday life, and then they see us as Christians acting differently. And that intrigues them, because they're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why did you act that way? And that's a time for a conversation with them to say, this is the reason why I act this particular way.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Because I have a friend that comes to church almost every Sunday if he's here,
Mhm.
without naming anybody.
Yeah.
And he never used to. And he's beginning to understand now.
Yeah.
It's very
How
true.
many churches are in Baldwin and Hammond?
In Baldwin and Hammond,
Yeah.
so Baldwin has at least 9. Hammond has at least 4.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, so at least 4 on their sign, but there's at least 9 here in Baldwin, which is pretty big for,
Yeah. The population here.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so I think that's what Jesus is sort of calling us to think about today, is how do we live our lives differently, and that living our lives differently matters. I mean, and what does it mean to live as a Christian? What do you guys think? When you hear that, live as a Christian, and I'm going to take away going to church from you, because I know that's a pretty standard answer, so I'm going to pull that away from you. What does it mean for you to live a Christian life? What does that look like?
Put others before yourself.
Put others before yourself.
Following
10.
10 commandments, following Jesus' principles.
Yeah.
And I see that That's why the world is the way it is now.
Yeah.
Because people don't go to church like they used to. So kids don't grow up in the church. They've taken religion of any kind, except Muslim, out of the schools. So where do people learn? Thou shalt not kill.
Right.
And we have all these shooters.
Hey,
So
every
where are they
day-
gonna learn that? Treat others like you want them to treat you.
Yeah.
Where are they gonna learn that?
It's a good question.
Our parents are the ones that taught us.
Yeah.
Right, I mean,
Yeah.
I'll be, half the time I didn't wanna go to church. I didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Yeah, you go to church, you're getting what?
You know, the parents aren't.
My dad
No,
would
the parents
roll
are-
over
it's
his
the
grave
parents.
and he saw
That's-
the
I
way
don't-
I was dressed to church because he's from the old school.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody has to.
Shirt and tie and yeah. Yeah, it's so yeah, it's we don't always really understand the influence that we have, and if we look at like our media, and stuff like that, you watch your YouTube videos. Are there a lot of channels about God, about faith, and how are they? It's one thing the way that we used to do things, where we used to talk about a lot of hell and brimstone. That I never thought was effective to begin with. But do we have, how are we teaching our youth what it means to live like a Christian, to act like a Christian, to be different in some sense? How do we love our neighbor? That has probably gone in the last 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, what are we on right now? Has gone steadily downhill. Because right now, love your neighbor, I would say, was a very radical statement to say right now. And should it be? Think of how many families have been sort of separated by the political process. How many people, because you're a Democrat or you're a Republican. I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm just saying, why can't you love each other? You are that divided that you can't, that something as, I'm going to say something really as meaningless as politics is not trumped by love. That we are so worried about our politics that we are not worried about that other person. Where have we gone? And I think that's, and you could say that for all sorts of things. How look at all the ways we are really good at dividing ourselves. We're really good at it.
To Mike's comment that if people aren't going to church and learning,
Yeah.
how are they going to find out who their neighbor is?
Right?
My neighbor is those who agree with what I
Yeah.
believe,
Yeah.
instead of knowing that everybody out there is your neighbor.
Yeah. And what does that mean? Too. So that's hard stuff too. It's not easy knowing that, the neighbor, that person you have to work with, has totally different views than you do. But yet, how do you work with them? How do you treat them as a neighbor? How do you treat them with respect? I'm not saying you agree with them. I think that's a lot of people are like, oh, I can't. I'm like, no, you don't have to agree with them. You just have to love them. There's a difference.
I know. It's so tiring
Yeah.
that in politics they slam each other.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
could go a step up and you hear, you could tell people that God loves you, and you know that, right? But do they?
Yeah. Because a lot of times, I can't tell you a number of people have told me that, well, God's mad at me. They hear that a lot. Well, God's disappointed you. God's mad at you. God doesn't, this is the reason why your life is the way it is because God doesn't like what you're doing. And so.
And you don't come to church to try to fix that?
Well, yeah. Well, no, they don't
No,
want to
they
come to
turn
church.
away.
Yeah, they turn
They
away
turn
because
away.
if God is that mad at them, why would I want to show up at God's house?
Is it that lack of understanding that if you have something bad in your life happen to you, well, that's God?
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. I can't tell you the number of people.
Christians aren't getting a free pass,
Right.
and we just have to understand.
Some of these are Christians too. I remember I had a gentleman I was working at St. John's, and he had been in the Vietnam War, and he says, because we were just talking, and he was like, I can never go back to church. And I said, well, why? He says, well, all the things I did. He said, God cannot forgive me for that. And I said, God can forgive you for that. God can forgive you for what you've done, if you repent. And he's like, no, God can't do that. And I said, well, why don't we do it right now? I said, I'm going to I got a book downstairs that we'll do a confession of forgiveness right now. And then you will hear those words of being free from this. He said, I don't believe you. I said, yeah, give me a couple. So I went down, grabbed the book. We went to, we were just in a separate room and we did it. And he cried. He said, I can't believe that God can forgive me. I said, God has forgiven you right now. You are forgiven. You do not have to live this way any longer.
He had a very narrow view of God, though.
Yeah. But a lot of people are taught that, though, too. So that's the problem is, if you watch our media, look at how God is portrayed in media. God is a vengeful God. God, you see a lot of villains in movies, and some of them are religious, fruitcakes or whatever you want to say. Then that they have a very narrow view of God. And so a lot of people fall into that. Well, if they have that narrow view, that must be the view. And so you don't have those positive sort of influences of what God can look like. So yeah, that's why it's so important that we live out our lives showing what the gospel message looks like. I know it feels like a lot of pressure on us, but it's not. It's just living your daily life, living that life. And so I'm going to challenge you this week. What does it look like to love your neighbor? What is it going to look like for you to love your neighbor this week? Even the person that drives you nuts. Even the guy who cuts you off in traffic.
One that drives you nuts.
Even the ones that drive you nuts. That's the hardest part.
They're the ones that probably need it the most.
And I struggle with this just as you guys do too. I really hate driving in traffic because people drive me nuts. I have to really watch my language when I'm driving. So I'm right there with you. I'm not on cloud 9 or have a bigger halo or anything like that. I'm right with you like that.
Corey was telling a real good story last night to us about when he was painting the kitchen, the ceiling.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? The paintbrush slipped and paint went all over and Corey started cussing. And you happened to walk in and you said, out of the clear blue, I would have said a lot more than that.
And having driven, yes. So, yeah. No, it's so how do we live our lives to let somebody know that they are loved?
Just like I was coming here.
Mm-hmm.
Just outside of Iowa. Anyway, I had California plates in the car. People are cutting me off. I says, "You want to do this?" Yeah, I have a lot more experience than you do.
Yeah. No, like I said,
No, it was. I forget where it was.
Yeah.
But it was just coming from Iowa into.
Yeah, those Iowa drivers are the worst.
No, come from Iowa into Minnesota.
Oh, into Minnesota? Yeah. So I want you to just think about that this week. There's, like I said, in a world that is unfortunately, like I said, you turn on the news, you find out somebody's yelling at somebody else. What does it look like differently now? Knowing that, how would you bring love and respect and humility into that situation? So that's what I'm going to charge you with this week.